morning, everybody, and happy Science Saturday. It is a beautiful Saturday morning. I think I have not been outside yet today, but that is okay because I assume that it's a beautiful day. I can see it out the window. We are talking about one of my favorite topics today: trees, native plants, native everything, all the amazing, beautiful things that grow here in the Virgin Islands that make up our amazing territory. And I am joined this morning by a Science Saturday two-timer. Rudy is joining us for the second time as a Science Saturday host, and I am so excited. Thank you so much. Rudy, for those who don't know you, can you introduce yourself? Who are you? Why are you? What are you doing here?
Well, good morning, Kitty, and everyone who's listening and watching. My name is Rudy O'Reilly. I'm a local botanist, and I've been studying trees for quite some time, and actually started my interest in plant taxonomy through bonsai, which is one of my hobbies as well. But I've worked on a number of publications as consultant for tree identification for native material, and it's fun. It's not just a hobby, it's fun. It's not just work. So I enjoyed it.
I love that. I love that you get to call yourself a botanist. And actually, fun fact, I was lucky enough to see Rudy at my cousin's wedding identifying a rare tree, because what better combination in a wedding? Shout out to my cousin Margaret and her now husband Clay. Tree lovers had the opportunity to identify a rare tree at the property where the wedding was, and that was a beautiful mashup. So all the places that your job and passion take you, that's really cool.
Thank you.
Yeah. So what are we talking about today?
So today we're talking about native trees, a few other plants, and why it's important to have them in our landscape, not just the natural landscape, but even extending that to our home landscape. A lot of people don't know what a native tree or native plant is, and although we see them every day, we may not recognize them as such, and many of the plants that we do see are actually not native.
Ooh.
So a native plant or native species is something that has not been introduced by people into the territory. So they were here practically before people were. And that genetic information has been evolving to our natural conditions here. And so even if you have a native species that we share with Florida, for example, they may look slightly different,
All right, that
but
makes sense.
taxonomically they're the same thing.
I imagine I would look different if I grew up in Florida too.
Oh, goodness. Well, that's part of the effects that the environment has on organisms. So that's again why it's important to have an idea as to what our native material looks like.
Okay, and I know that you have a presentation that you're going to share with us, but first I have a question. In the definition of native, you said that it has been it was not introduced by humans. So native, good, yeah. What about trees or species that were brought by humans a very, very, very long time ago? Is there a different classification for that, or can we, I don't know, I always feel like there has to be a different way for us to talk about it, or maybe I'm just wildly informed, but so I'm just going to ask this question once, and then we're going to go on to your presentation. I've always been really curious about ganip trees, or canip, or ganipa, whatever we want to call them today. I thought that ganips were native to India and were introduced to the Caribbean. Is that true?
I think canep is native to Central and South America and were introduced here.
And introduced, but like hundreds of years ago.
Maybe about 100 years, 200 years ago. But
Gasp, I thought it was longer ago than that.
Well, the mango, for example, is native to India.
Uh-huh.
That's what was introduced from India to here.
Oh, so I've
But
combined all my
that's a
plant
good
knowledge.
example.
Ah,
But
okay.
then you asked about something that was introduced many years ago. There are some plants that we suspect may have been introduced by early um, Tainos or native people. And one of the things that's very interesting to note is that if it's on St. Croix, for example, and it's not anywhere else, that's almost like an indication that it may have been introduced. We have something called Brazilian rain tree that occurs in Salt River, and that was one of the biggest native habitats for early peoples. And that plant only grows essentially from Judas Fantasy to Blue Mountain. It's not
Wow.
in Puerto Rico, it's not in St. Thomas, St. John, and it's essentially from Brazil,
That
South
is
America.
fascinating. Now I want to go find one. I have a field trip I need to do. That's really cool. All right. Well, Rudy, I'm going to stop distracting you from your presentation. We can get started. And then I'm going to keep on interrupting because we all know who I am.
Yes, feel free to ask anytime. So, as I mentioned earlier, when we look at our landscape today, a number of plants that we see in that landscape are actually introduced species. Uh, in the slide that I'm showing now, this was actually taken from a hilltop, looking down during the dry season. And one of the things that jumps out at you are those gray, straw-colored trees that are all over that landscape there. And it's a good indication as to how many of those trees are there in this particular landscape. And that particular tree is a tibbet tree. And tibbet is one of those trees that's been introduced. But in this scenery, I can see Guinep, I can see Tantan, there's mahogany way in the background. And a lot of what we're seeing here are just not native. One of the issues that we have with losing native vegetation is habitat loss. So when we clear land and we don't replace it with vegetation or the right type of vegetation, that causes other issues. In this slide, you're seeing sheet and rill erosion. And that's basically when you don't protect that soil with vegetation once it's been uncovered. That soil now, after heavy rains, can run downstream and into our guts, and that will then affect our native fish. What you see here is the mountain mullet and the freshwater goby. And
Those are native fish that live in our guts.
they do. And
That's
the
so cool.
interesting thing about our fish is that they actually hatch in brackish water. And
Oh.
the life cycle is very interesting. So they hatch in brackish water, they swim upstream, they reproduce, they lay their eggs, and those eggs stay there. Even after maybe 8 years until the next huge storm event, those eggs then get washed downstream. And as they come in contact with salt water or brackish water, they then hatch, and the larvae will then swim upstream again. So it's very interesting, their life cycle.
That is crazy. Man.
Now, I've always been interested in fish. I've had fish since I was in kindergarten. And these photos are actually taken in some aquariums that I've had. And it's a very interesting cycle to be able to watch them on your own time. It's just fascinating.
That's really cool. And so with the erosion, it's silting that out, bad for the native fish.
Correct. It will cloud the water. It would affect their habitat, their gills, and so they are affected. Many of our native birds, such as the bridal quail dove and the crested hummingbird, of course, they have evolved with the native vegetation, and they eat specific plants. Even some of the non-native flowers, the hummingbird will visit, obviously. But again, a lot of the fauna have evolved with the plants that are growing here. So once we start removing those native trees and shrubs, then it's not just habitat loss for the vegetation, it's habitat loss for the birds as well, and lizards and snails, and right down the line. Some of the issues that affect the native population is when we import plants from off island. Um, Even if you're bringing in the same species from someplace else, it's not the same genetic material that evolved in our area.
Oh,
And
that's really interesting. And when you say it out loud, it kind of feels like duh. But I had never considered that before.
well, I have a slide that's a good example of that, and it's something that we normally don't consider. And even between islands, we have genetic variation. Even within the island, we have genetic variation. So again, since those plants have evolved there specifically, it's just a good idea to try to propagate more of those. Introducing plants from the outside also has a tendency to bring pests that the plants may not have evolved with, and so they don't have a good defense mechanism for them. And we've seen that in a number of cases with sea grape, for example, where there's a borer that will kill the growing tip of the tree.
Ooh.
So there are a number of issues that we need to be cognizant of. Invasive species, some of the plants we introduce can take over. Native habitats being lost again, and some of the plants that are introduced, they don't have a natural predator or something that feeds on them, and so they can grow unchecked and just take over entire ecosystems.
What is that? Is that looks like a pond?
Yeah, this is called water lettuce, and it was introduced. And you can see it's just covering a huge area of this particular pond.
Wow.
And what are they affecting? This would be the native plants that would now have been outcompeted against. So there's a native water lily, a native sword plant, and those plants are pretty interesting. And again, I've grown those in aquariums, and they're pretty nice to have around as well. So here's an example of two related plants. It's called inkberry, the black fruited one, and that's the native scavola. And then there's one that's been introduced for landscaping. I think it's from Polynesia. And the one with the white fruit is actually taking over some of the beaches and is outcompeting in some cases with the native one.
So the leaves look pretty similar, but then so the main difference is the actual fruit, the berry. We want black ink, not white ink. Interesting.
Right. And the exotic one, the leaves are a little bigger as well.
Interesting.
But in plant taxonomy, one of the key issues is the fruits or flowers, and that's what distinguishes one species from another, along with other characters such as leaf shape, leaf size.
Yeah. Last time you were on Science Saturday, you were showing us all about the leaf shape and how to differentiate different species. I remember.
And here's a good example now of variation of the same species. This is pink cedar between two different habitats. So the smaller leaf is something you find in the drier areas, and the larger leaf is something you find in the more moist areas. So it could be a factor of habitat, it could be a factor of genetics, it could be a factor of both. But the plants respond to their environment by growing differently, evolving differently, and having different characteristics. Mind you, these are the characteristics that we can see. We can't see defense mechanisms, we can't see salt tolerance, we can't see drought tolerance necessarily.
So we actually were having a conversation in our office at the Territorial Parks office last week, this week, I can't remember, but we were talking about sea purslane, which is my favorite seaside snack. I think that it is delicious. It has a lot of vitamin C, but the leaves sometimes are really flat, and sometimes I'm going to go ahead and say chunkier because
Hmm.
that's just feels like the right word for me. Um, and one of our parks employees, Kayla, our research and restoration coordinator, was at a conference in Puerto Rico, and she did a field trip, saw sea purslane being grown in fish tanks, like in hydroponics, and the leaves were all super super flat, which I thought was really interesting because I had always assumed that the chunkier leaves would have more water intake. But it's the opposite. It seems like with more access to water, they're flatter, as if they don't have to retain it. I have done zero research on this, but when you showed me this picture, it just made me think about that. So, really interesting stuff that we can research for later.
Right, and making that same comparison, something like buttonwood mangrove, for example, they do have saltwater leaves that are thicker. But if that same plant or cutting of that same plant is grown away from the salt, they tend to get leaves that are much flatter.
Okay.
So those are some of the physical responses to the conditions that they're growing.
Interesting.
Now, here's some variation between islands. Now, St. Croix is geologically isolated from St. Thomas from the Puerto Rican bank. And the lignum vitae here, for example, is very different. Well, to those of us who are looking that closely. Um, so the one that we have here is a smaller leaflets, and not necessarily so, but they're usually a little darker. And compared to the ones in St. Thomas, the Lesser Antilles, those plants tend to have larger leaflets and more of a yellow or orange midvein or stem.
That is really interesting. Also, I would like to say I am not starting any battles between our sister islands, but we can see the differences in the trees.
It's just an awareness. It's just an awareness that we're trying to create.
Uh, that's really cool. And I can these pictures are great. I can see those differences.
So again, here's lignum vitae close up. Purple flowers. A lot of people love that plant as a landscape plant. It grows very slowly, and those flowers turn into green fruits and then into yellow or bright orange pods with red seeds on the inside. So it's a very attractive plant. And that the wood has been used to make bearings because once it interacts with salt water, it actually self lubricates. And I think the Tainos use some of the sap against some infections as well.
Oh, I know that lignin vitae is a really important native tree, but so many different facts about it. Really cool.
Yes, and this is one that most people may know. And we're going to start looking at some of the things that you may not know. Maria galba or galba is something that's fairly common as well. A very common species that's used in Puerto Rico for street side planting. But here it's not used so much, but it's a very nice looking plant.
Okay.
Thick, dark green leaves. They usually grow in the moister areas, but they can grow in a variety of different conditions, and they do very well as landscape trees.
Interesting. Is there a reason it's not used as much here as in Puerto Rico, or just how trends go?
Right, and again, it's more of an awareness. And
Mm-hmm.
when we bring the awareness to more people, then if this is something they're interested in, they can seek this out, get seeds of it planted in their landscape, and you have a native tree growing in your yard.
Interesting.
Gree or black olive, and the term gree is actually a corruption of the name Gregory, and it's Gregory wood is what it's called in some of the other islands. It has been used for timber. Very I won't say necessarily difficult to propagate, but it has a very low germination rate from the tiny seeds that are produced. But once you have seedlings, they grow very nicely into
So
very
I think
thick.
it's interesting that you say that Grigri is off of the word Gregory. I've heard people say that here on St. Thomas, Gregory Channel is named because it's lined in Grigri trees.
Yes, yes. And so you can make all of these connections and associations. And it's just very interesting to have all that information and that history. And it's all connected. So it's very, very interesting. Dog almond. This is a good indicator of riparian area. This particular plant likes moist areas, and you can use this along the guts if you have a reforestation project, for example. This does very well. Uh, Bright pink flowers and fruit that looks like an almond. Not quite edible, but another beautiful tree that can be
Not
added.
quite edible. It's almost edible.
Well, bats do eat it.
Okay, I was gonna say, don't mess with me, Rudy. If it's edible, I'm gonna eat it.
Oh, I have a lot of stories about that.
Oh, no.
In fact, one of the last slides is a good one for not quite edible, but
Okay,
for
but the bats
edible.
like it, and I love bats. They are our only indigenous mammal.
That is correct. I think Agoutis were here at one point, or maybe in Puerto Rico, not necessarily here, but bats, yes. Sweet pea, here's another good one. Edible pods. If you can imagine a tamarind that's a light green color, and the inside, the seeds are covered with something that looks like cotton candy. That's what this pod looks like. It is edible, slightly sweet, a little watery,
All right,
but
bring it on.
beautiful.
I'm hungry already.
Another good one, locust. This one needs a lot of space. It's a huge tree. Some people call it stinking toe. And growing up here, that's one of the plants we'd collect the seeds and play the game cock, where the objective was to break the other person's seed with your seed by attaching a string to it and slamming it against their seed.
Oh, that's a good way to open it. There may or may not be video footage of me trying to open a stinky toe in my DPNR office with random office supplies. I'm not going to confirm it. I'm just going to say that I did eventually get a snack.
Oh man, and the aroma is wonderful. So not.
Yes, I opened a stinky toe in the office.
A nice transition here. Locust berry. Here's one you may not know. Very rare plant, but the fruits are edible. And it's related to the West Indian cherry,
Ooh.
but the flowers open pink on a small spike with a number of flowers on there. And by afternoon, they turn red. And the fruit is a small fruit with a hard seed on the inside. It has a similar taste to jojo, the green. But, interesting plant, but in terms of aesthetics, it's a beautiful, beautiful plant. And one of the rare ones, pond apple, at least for St. Croix. Very few plants of this left. It's related to the sugar apples and soursop. But another native plant that you may or may not know.
This showed up. Somebody had a picture of pond apple on the. There's a Facebook group on St. Thomas called Gardening on the Rock, and somebody had a picture of one of these recently.
Right. And these typically grow around riparian areas as well, around ponds and the guts, and some, I think, in some areas close to mangroves, so not necessarily in the salted areas, but that's where it gets its name from, pond apple.
Okay, that makes sense.
Cocoa plum, another good one that we may know.
Oh, this is my favorite. I love cocoa plum. I
Yeah, this
think
is the
all
perfect.
landscaping everywhere should be cocoa plum.
Yeah, this is another good example of genetic variation because the fruits can be white. I've seen them white in Cuba. St. Croix, they're a light yellow with a pink blush. And then
Gosh,
on root
I've never
seed,
seen
they're
that.
dark pink. Completely different. And there's a black variety as well, or
That
dark
is
purple.
fascinating. So on the ones I've seen on St. Thomas are very dark and would be like the black purple.
Yeah, yeah. Now here's a good one. This is birchberry, and as you see here, it's being used as a hedge.
Mm-hmm.
But here are the fruits, and
Mm.
this is one of the plants related to guava berry. And many of the plants in the guava berry family are beautiful landscaping plants for the home landscape. Not all of them have fruits that are palatable. The birchberry, the fruit is, it has a very similar flavor to guava berry without the bitter finish of the skin.
Oh, that
So
sounds
this is
nice.
another really, really good plant. But again, these are just a few examples of what we have here locally that can be collected for seed. Hopefully, I think through the Urban Forestry Council at the Department of Agriculture, we'll start to get some of these plants propagated, and hopefully they'll be more available in the future for homeowners to have more access to these. But that's pretty much the list that I have, and
That is
we
a
can.
delicious list.
Oh yes.
Wow. All right. So, I mean, it's not Science Saturday if I don't talk about being hungry, but I really, really love the connection to, native plants that are good for the environment, the native fish, the native birds, the bats eating them, but how we can look at our man made areas or woman made areas, human made areas. All right, I'm not going to go into that. How can we continue to use our native plants to replace, invasive landscaping? So that is really cool. Um, so, Rudy, what what do you want everybody to remember about your presentation? What is your take home message?
Well, the take home is that we have a myriad of local plants that can be used for our landscape.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a great idea to become familiar with what has been growing here for eons, and not just
Woo!
stuff that were introduced, but we have many many things here that have some interest, not just historical interest or use or value, medicinal, landscape, aesthetics,
Mm-hmm.
a number of things. And most of these that I introduced here have edible fruits, and I think that's a great way for people to become interested in some of the local or native material here. So,
Yeah. So if somebody wants to learn more, like if somebody was really into what you were talking about today, but maybe doesn't have the best memory, didn't memorize everything you said, what are some good resources you would recommend that Virgin Islanders use to check up on our, whether it be landscaping or maybe if we're out walking around and possibly want to eat everything that we find? What kind of books? What should we be carrying with us as reference?
definitely don't recommend eating everything you find.
I mean, I eat anything you hand to me, so please don't hand me poison fruits. But yes, we want to do it correctly. So,
Well, there are a couple of publications. Some of the Bibles for those of us who study botany. There's something called Trees of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands.
okay,
Two huge volumes, and they have illustrated pages, botanical descriptions. There's something we just did with USDA called native trees for conservation uses. It's in Spanish, but
okay,
it has really nice photos and descriptions and uses for those plants as well. And of course, there's traditional medicinal plants of the VI,
okay.
native bushes in there that's been used traditionally for for teas and rubs and what have you. There's also something by the botanical garden. I don't recall the name. Native, like something like native trees for landscaping.
Okay.
But there are a couple of publications out there that highlight what we have growing here.
All right. Excellent. I'm going to go back and rewatch our video and write those down in the comments. Or if anybody's listening and remembers those already, throw them in the comments. I'm going to go buy those, a few copies for the office. Rudy, thank you so much for talking with us this morning. It is wonderful to see you as always. My take home is I am not going to eat off of every single plant that I see. I am going to wait until somebody holding one of those books hands it to me. But I'm still going to try to open Stinky Toe in the office because it's too yummy. Everyone out there, thank you so much for joining us today. Whatever you're doing for the rest of the day, whether you're heading to the beach, heading to maybe a friendly neighborhood protest, if you're watching from somewhere else, whatever's going on today, don't eat the fruit unless you know that it is not only edible, but palatable. And enjoy it, take advantage of our native trees, and have a beautiful day. Thank you, everyone. I will see you next month. I don't know where, I don't know who I'll be talking to, but Chantel does. Hey Chantel, I know you're in the background. Have a wonderful day, everybody. Bye.